Let's say the brewery is yours. Your ale is finished on a Tuesday morning. It is the best thing you will make all month. Thick, sweet, still warm at the bottom of the vat, and the smell of it fills the whole house. By the end of the week, it is turning, not cheaper, turning, going sour in the vat, and there is nothing you can do about it. There is no chilling it, no sealing it, no sending it somewhere it will fetch more. You cannot hold it back and wait for a better price either. You have days. That is the whole window, and every batch you ever make will live and die inside it. Here's the strange part. Those few days are not a problem inside the business. They are the business. They set what you need to start. They set whether you can ever be rich. And right now, in your lifetime, brewers are coming off ships from across the North Sea, carrying a plant that stretches that window. When it stretches, this trade gets taken out of the hands of the people who built it and handed to somebody else entirely. Meanwhile, in a port town on the Norfolk coast, one of the wealthiest women in England is about to put everything she has into a brewery. She will hire the best brewers money can buy. She will lose all of it to something that nobody in Europe could see yet. Start with the physical facts, because the money makes no sense without them. You take barley, you soak it until it sprouts, which wakes up the enzymes inside the grain. Then you dry it over a kiln to stop it growing. That is malt. You crush it, you mix it with hot water, and the enzymes turn the starch into sugar. You drain off the sweet liquid, which is called wort. Then you add barm, the living foam saved off your last successful batch, and you wait. What you have at the end is ale. An ale in England at this point is unhopped. There are no hops extending its shelf life. Bacteria can turn the remaining sugars towards sourness, so the clock starts running the moment fermentation finishes. How long you actually get depends on the strength of the brew and the weather that week. A strong batch in a cold cellar holds longer than a weak one in August. But we are talking about days, not weeks, and nobody in this trade is planning around anything else. One piece of vocabulary, because it matters later. In England in this period, ale usually means the unhopped drink, and beer usually means the hopped one. Usually. The terms are not stable everywhere. Their meanings shift depending on who is writing and why. If you have seen a neat three-way chart of ale, beer, and tavern drink, that is the internet's version, not the archives. For the next 20 minutes, stop thinking about money and start thinking about temperature, foam, and how a thing smells on the fourth day. That is what this business actually runs on. So the first question is not what it costs to build, it is how much you can afford to lose every few days. Here is where it gets genuinely surprising, and I will be honest. This caught me out. You do not need a brewery. What you need is a hearth, which you already have, add a few wooden tubs, some pots, water and grain. That is a working ale business, run out of the kitchen you already cook in, and across most of medieval England that is exactly what it was. That explains something people usually explain with sentiment. This trade was overwhelmingly run by women, and the reason is not that brewing was thought of as women's work in some soft cultural sense. The reason is the capital requirement. When the entry cost of a business is close to nothing, and the work happens in a domestic building, the business goes to whoever is already standing in that building. Judith Bennett's work on English brewsters is the study to read here, and the pattern holds across hundreds of villages. But near zero is not zero, and one surviving document tells you what the real floor was. In 1348, a London brewer called Lawrence Lelong died, and somebody wrote down what was in his workshop: lead vessels for heating water, then a lead cistern for steeping barley, a lead trough with a tap, a rearing vat for fermentation, and a wooden mashing vat valued at 18 pence. 18 pence for the wooden tub. An unskilled laborer in England at the end of that century earned somewhere around 3¼ pence a day, so the cheapest serious item on that list, the plain wooden vat, costs nearly a week of a man's life. And it is the cheapest thing on the list. The lead pieces cost multiples of it. One more number to calibrate how much of this stuff people were drinking. Servants in religious houses were often rationed at around a gallon of ale per person per day. A gallon. That is not a feast, that is Tuesday. When you hear how small these operations were, hold that demand figure next to it. Cheap to start, which sounds like good news right up until you ask the only question that matters. How far can you sell it? Now the clock does its first real piece of work. Your product dies in days, so your entire market extends only as far as a person will walk with an empty jug, buy from you, and carry the ale home before it goes over. That is it, the whole map. No warehousing it or sending it downriver. No building a name in the next town, because by the time your ale arrives there, it is vinegar and your name is worse than nothing. Be precise about this ceiling, because it is easy to overstate. You can brew a bigger batch, and substantial urban ale operations did exist. What you cannot do is sell further away. The limit is on distance, not volume, and chemistry sets it rather than law. So the business has a shape that no amount of skill will change. You can be the best brewer in your parish. You will never be the best brewer in England. because England is not reachable from your kitchen. You learn where the edge of that window is by smell, not by testing or measuring, but by putting your face over the vat on the fourth morning and knowing. There is a sharpness that comes up underneath the sweetness, faint at first, like the room has been left shut too long. Once you can smell it, the batch is already gone. What you are actually smelling is bacteria eating the sugar you paid for and giving you acid back. Nobody will know why for another 400 years, but every brewer in England knows the smell. Into that ceiling, the crown drops a price cap. The assize of bread and ale dates to 1266, and it is the first real food and drink regulation in English law. What it does is tie the price of your ale to the price of grain. Here is the scale. When a quarter of wheat is selling at 3 shillings to 3 shillings and 4 pence, a brewer inside a town has to sell 2 gallons for a penny. Outside a town, 3 gallons for a penny. Read that again and notice what it is actually doing. When grain gets more expensive, the penny does not move. Your measure shrinks instead. You hand over less ale for the same coin. That is medieval shrinkflation, and it is pointed directly at you. A bad harvest raises your costs, and the law forbids you from raising your price. So the shortfall comes out of your margin. The system is designed so that the brewer absorbs the bad year, and the drinker does not. Enforcement comes in the form of a man called the ale conner. He is a sworn local officer whose job is to taste your batch and set what you are allowed to charge for it. You are not permitted to sell before he has inspected it. If you sell early or above the price he sets, you are fined, and the penalties escalate until you are put out of the trade entirely. Since somebody always brings this up, the ale conner did not test your ale by pouring it on a bench, sitting in it in leather trousers, and seeing whether he stuck. That story is Victorian. There is no medieval evidence for it, and if your ale were sugary enough to glue a man to a plank, he would have known that from the first mouthful. He drank it. That was the test. So, a fixed price, a product measured in days, and a market measured in footsteps. On paper, this business makes nobody rich. That is your first clue that the money is not in the ale. Go back to the vat while it is working. There is a thick head of foam sitting on top of your fermenting ale. You skim it off and you keep it because that is what starts your next batch. It is called barm. In the records of the period, it carries another name, God's Good. God's Good, nobody knew what it was. They knew it worked, and they knew that if you had it, your ale rose, and if you did not, it sat there like water. So they named it after the only agency available to explain it. Here's what makes that foam an asset rather than a leftover. Bakers need it too. Bread rises on the same organism, and a baker cannot conjure a reliable culture out of thin air any more than you can. What he can do is come to you, since you have a vat that is actively working and he does not. So you are not a brewer who happens to have a byproduct. You are the only reliable supplier of a living input that the town's bread depends on. That is a different kind of position entirely. That is leverage. For a long time, brewers gave it away or handed it over for a farthing, framing the exchange as a Christian kindness, which is exactly the sort of arrangement the name suggests. By the 15th century, complaints start appearing about brewers who have worked out what they are sitting on, refusing to hand over the barm and charging bakers hard cash for it. The gift became a chokehold. There is a second waste stream too. The spent grain left after mashing, called draff, gets sold as animal feed. Worth having, not worth a paragraph. The physical scene is worth holding on to. You are standing over an open vat with a shallow wooden dish, taking the foam off the top in slow passes, so you do not stir the whole thing up. It is warm. It smells like bread already. A boy from the bakehouse 3 streets over is standing in your doorway with a covered pot, waiting because his master cannot start tomorrow's dough until you decide what today's price is. So the most valuable thing in this building is something nobody can see, name, or make on purpose. Hold on to that, because it is also the thing that is going to destroy somebody. Stop the cost stack here. We are not going to keep adding to it because in your lifetime, a second version of this business appears, and you have to price it separately. Brewers across the North Sea have been putting hops in the wort. Hops are a preservative. The drink they produce lasts weeks rather than days, and in the 15th century, the technique takes hold in England, carried by brewers from the Low Countries. So now there are 2 businesses, same grain, same water, and almost nothing else in common. Ale house. Shelf life is measured in days, the market is within walking distance, the heat source is a household hearth, and the starting capital is about a week's wages in wooden vessels. A manor court fine functions as your de facto license. Beer house. Shelf life is measured in weeks, and the market is anywhere a ship or cart can reach. Every single line of the cost stack changes. Boiling commercial volumes of hopped wort is beyond any kitchen fire, so you need a masonry furnace. On top of it, you need metal. At Bourne Manor in Cambridgeshire, the accounts show the smith casting 2 lead vats, one of them weighing 240 pounds, specifically to heat grain during malting. A century and a half later, in 1486, a London brewer named William Robinson has a copper brewing kettle with an oak frame built around the rim to hold it. There is no clean London figure for the building, so here is a proxy clearly labeled. In 1326 and 1327, Bourne Manor put up a new south wing, a solar and a brewhouse furnace for 82 shillings and 7 pence, 991 pence. At 3¼ pence a day, that is over 300 days of unskilled labor. A manor, not a townhouse, and a century early, so treated as a shape rather than a price. Next comes the guild. In London, the Brewers' Company runs on quarterage at 12 pence a year. Now for the number that decides everything. Out of 1/4 of malt, a household ale operation in the 1380s is getting somewhere around 53 to 56 gallons. A fully commercial beer brewhouse, working the way this trade ends up working, gets around 144 gallons out of the same quarter. I have to be honest about that second figure. It comes from a Westminster Abbey operation a century and a half after the period we are standing in, one that is essentially industrial. It is not a medieval average. It is the direction the road goes. But look at the size of the gap anyway. That is nearly 3 times the sellable liquid from the same expensive grain. Grain is your largest cost by a distance. Anybody who can afford the copper is about to take the market from anybody who can't. That copper is not just expensive, it is heavy. A vat like that arrives by cart and goes into a purpose-built housing, and once it is in, it is in. You cannot lift it. There is no hiding it from an assessor, and no carrying it away from a bad debt in the night. Everything that makes it valuable also makes it a thing that sits still and can be taken. Better product, bigger market, nearly triple the yield. There is only one problem with the beer house. Look at what it costs to walk through that door, and then look at who is legally allowed to sign for it. The new business rewards scale, credit, and organization, so the people who win it start behaving accordingly. They stop competing with each other and start negotiating as a block. We know this because the Brewers' Company employed a clerk named William Portland, and from 1418 onward, he kept a working memorandum book. It survived the Great Fire, and it survived the Blitz, and it lets us watch a medieval trade association argue with a city government in close to real time. The argument is with Richard Whittington, the real one. By this point, the 4-time mayor is nearing the end of both his life and his final term. He goes after the brewers publicly and calls them fat swans. And the accusation is specific. They ride out into the countryside and buy up malt before it reaches the open market, and get rich while the commons go short. Then he hits them where it hurts. The company is fined £20 over their use of the Chepe conduit water. £20 is 4,800 pence. Set that against the 12 pence annual subscription, and you can see what kind of blow it is. Water was already a running sore. London brewers had been barred from drawing on the conduit in 1337 and again in 1345 because commercial brewing was draining the supply that the public drank from. A brewery in a medieval city is not a quiet neighbor. It takes the water, it takes the fuel, and it fills the street with smoke. Portland's book then gives us the thing the brewers were actually protecting. Ordered to sell their best ale at 42 pence a barrel, they admit under oath that they have been charging 60. Those two numbers reveal the whole game. The price cap was never a ceiling that held firm. It was an opening position. The guild existed to fund the argument, and when the fine landed, the strategy was to delay, wait out the mayor, and settle with a more sympathetic one. Now you know who got rich from the new business. Look at the other column. This is the quiet part, the one I keep thinking about. Before the fork, women dominated this trade. Afterwards, they did not. No decree caused the change, and nobody banned anything. What happened was arithmetic. The beer house needs a furnace, imported metal, bulk grain bought ahead of the season, and a guild membership. That means it also needs credit, contracts, and property held in your own name. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity sat with her husband's. She could not straightforwardly borrow, sign, or hold the assets on her own account. As the capital requirement rose, the threshold for ownership rose with it, silently, without anybody having to write it down. Women who had owned the trade moved into working it. Tapsters, hucksters, servants in somebody else's brewhouse. I want to be careful here because this is the kind of story that gets flattened. It happened across generations, not in a year, and historians still argue about how much weight to assign to technology, law, and plain demography. It was a slow squeeze, not an eviction. Widowhood forms the clearest exception. A widow could hold and run the business outright, in her own name, with the guild treating her as a full member. Portland's book has Alice Hoare paying her 12 pence quarterage year after year from 1418 to 1420. The catch was that widows with profitable brewhouses faced heavy pressure to remarry, and remarriage moved the assets again. Researching this one, I realized I had already met this business from the other end. When I put the owner's ledger together, the book opens in a Northamptonshire village 100 years before any of this. It follows a woman brewing in her own kitchen, fined by the manor court over and over, running a perfectly sound operation, and what eventually threatened her business had nothing to do with hops at all. Different century, same vat. It is chapter 1, and there are 9 more businesses after it. Link is below. That fork made some people rich and pushed others out, but it never solved the one thing that could empty a brewhouse in a week, and that failure struck one of the richest women in England. Bishop's Lynn, Norfolk, in the first years of the 15th century. Today, it is called King's Lynn. Marjorie Kempe is the daughter of John Brunham, who was mayor of that town 5 times, and is married to a merchant. She has capital, standing, and access to the best staff in the market. She goes into brewing, and by her own account, she is one of the greatest brewers in the town for 3 or 4 years. Then, the ale starts failing. The detail she gives is what makes it land. The ale stood as fair under the barm as any man might wish to see, and then the barm fell. The whole brew was lost, then the next one, and the one after that. Her servants could not fix it. They were skilled, she says so plainly, and it made no difference. Eventually they left, ashamed to be associated with it, and she walked away from the trade. A modern brewer would call that a stuck fermentation. The yeast stops working before the job is done, and there are a dozen reasons why. Temperature, a weak or contaminated culture, something in the water, or something lodged in the grain of the wooden vessels that you can never fully scrub out. Every one of those explanations requires you to know that yeast is an organism. Kemp did not have that knowledge. Nobody did. So she reached for the framework that was available, which was a moral one, and concluded that God was punishing her for pride, for her fine clothes, for wanting to be somebody in that town. This is the payoff of what we found in the foam. The most valuable asset in the medieval brewhouse was a living thing that nobody could see, name, test, or replace on demand. When it worked, you held the town's bread supply. When it stopped, there was no diagnosis available at any price. You could not buy your way out because the thing that had failed had not been discovered yet. One honest note, because we do this properly here, she says she was one of the greatest brewers in Lynn. The surviving assize records, filed under her husband's name as was customary for a married woman's business, put her at 6 quarters of malt a week in her best year. That is a substantial commercial operation, but scholars who have gone through the Lynn figures put her in the second rank rather than the first. She may have built her fall a little taller than it was. She still lost everything. So, 2 businesses, 1 clock, and a thing in the vat that nobody could name. What did it actually pay? Both sides of the fork, with the tiers said out loud. Ale house, good year. It is a real income out of almost no capital, which is rare in any century. It is also capped by how far a person will walk, exposed to a price you do not set, and 1 warm week from losing a batch outright. It is a machine for making a living. It is not a machine for making a fortune, and it was never built to be one. Beer house, good year. If you sell 500 barrels at 60 pence each, gross revenue lands at roughly £125. That is my reconstruction, built from documented parts, and I want it labeled as such rather than presented as somebody's surviving accounts. Set it against a skilled craftsman earning roughly £7 to £8 a year. This is merchant money. This is the tier where you fund a chantry, endow a school, and get buried somewhere expensive. Beer house, bad year. The same copper that made you rich is the collateral your grain supplier claims. It cannot be moved, cannot be hidden, and the business cannot run without it. A liquidity problem in most trades is a bad quarter. Here it is terminal, because the thing they seize is the thing that boils. So here is the honest answer to the question running through all of this. Yes, you could get rich owning a brewery, but only after the fork, and only if you could sign for the copper. Before it, no, and that was rather the point of the old arrangement. That is why the kettles turn up in wills, not the house, the pot, named, valued, and left to a specific person the way land is. In this trade, the fortune was never the building. It was the metal inside it, and everybody knew it. They called it God's good, not as poetry, as a description, the most accurate one available to them. Something arrives in your vat and is clearly doing work. You cannot see it, you cannot make it. Yet when you have it, the whole street eats. What else would you call that? So you sold God's good to the baker at whatever the morning's price turned out to be. And for as long as it kept rising, you were the most quietly powerful person on your street. When it stopped, you assumed it had been taken back. Not that a culture had failed, that you had been judged. Because when the only explanation on offer for a living organism is a moral one, A bad batch is not a technical problem. It is a verdict. The brewery was never really a drink business. It was a business whose most valuable worker, most expensive asset, and most likely cause of ruin were all the same thing, and that thing would go without a scientific identity for another 400 years. At the start of all this, the clock was never really measuring the ale. It was measuring how long you had before the part you did not understand made the decision for you.